For much of the post-war era, the Philippines was one of Southeast Asia's leading economies, posting decades of solid growth. As recently as the early 2010s, the Philippines was celebrated for 6 to 7% annual growth, fueled by services, especially business process, outsourcing and remittances, and a burgeoning middle class. By contrast, Vietnam only emerged from severe poverty after its Choi Moi renovation reforms began in 1986, gradually opening its socialist economy to markets and investment. However, after 2010, Vietnam's economy accelerated. It joined the WTO in 2007, deepened ties with China and ASEAN, and built up its industrial base. The decade 2015 to 2025 saw Vietnam's growth catch the world's attention. Vietnam averaged about 6 to 7% real GDP growth, with only a brief dip during the COVID pandemic, while the Philippines also grew at 6% pre-pandemic, but took a harder hit in 2020. For example, the Philippine GDP per capita, nominal, fell from $3,400 in 2019 to $3,227 in 2020, whereas Vietnam's rose from $3,440 to $3,534. In part, this was because Vietnam contained COVID more successfully, early lockdowns and mobilization of resources, allowing its factories to keep running. As one analyst observed, by 2020, Vietnam overtook the Philippines in per capita GDP, and up to now, Vietnam continues to surpass the Philippines. Several broader trends underlie these paths. The Philippines' growth has remained service-led, finance, real estate, BPO, with only modest manufacturing, while agriculture's share has declined. Its industrialization stalled. Manufacturing now accounts for only approximately 18% of GDP and 7 to 8% of jobs, down slightly from the previous decade. In contrast, Vietnam has steadily industrialized. Manufacturing comprises about 23 to 24% of Vietnam's GDP, and the country is now a major global exporter of electronics, textiles, and machinery. Vietnam's urbanization and education have kept pace. A recent Philippine delegation noted, Vietnam spends about $746 per primary pupil, 2022, versus $328 in the Philippines, contributing to vastly better learning outcomes. Vietnamese 15-year-olds outperform many OECD countries on PISA tests, whereas over 90% of Filipino children suffer learning poverty. To put this video into simplicity, Vietnam has slowly overtaken the Philippines in GDP per capita, an indicator that reflects the average income of a country's citizens and often serves as a rough gauge of overall economic well-being. But there is more to the data than just GDP per capita and manufacturing, so let's unpack all the reasons that led Vietnam to surpass the Philippines. Vietnam's rise is clearest in the headline numbers. By 2023, Vietnam's nominal GDP reached about $429 billion, roughly on par with the Philippines, $437 billion. Critically, Vietnam achieved this with a smaller population, approximately 100 million versus 115 million, so its GDP per capita is higher. World Bank data show Vietnam's per capita GDP jumped from $2,577 in 2015 to $4,282 in 2023, while the Philippines went from $2,910 to $3,805. The gap was especially telling during the pandemic. After 2020, Vietnam's per capita income recovered to $3,704 in 2021 versus the Philippines' $3,484. Vietnam has also led all major ASEAN economies in 2024 growth, approximately 7.1%, and is projected to grow between 5 to 6.5% in 2025. With continued 6 to 8% growth, Vietnam's economy is on track to exceed $500 billion in 2026, IMF forecast, and push per capita above $5,000. By contrast, Philippine growth has averaged 5 to 6% recently. If trends continue, its GDP may reach $500 billion at the same time as Vietnam in 2026. Trade has been a major driver. Vietnam's export boom is dramatic. Merchandise exports roughly doubled from $162 billion in 2015 to $354 billion in 2023. This surge reflects Vietnam's integration into global supply chains, with rising shipments of electronics, garments, and machinery. In contrast, Philippine exports grew only from $59 billion to $74 billion over the same period. The gap is huge. Vietnam's 2023 exports were nearly 5 times larger. The effects show up in the trade balance. Vietnam swung from a deficit decades ago to a massive surplus, about 8% of GDP in 2023, while the Philippines' trade deficit widened dramatically to a deficit of $61.5 billion and a negative 14.1% of GDP. This means Vietnam is exporting far more value, whereas the Philippines is increasingly importing, especially fuel and intermediate goods. Foreign investment tells a similar story. Vietnam has been a major magnet for FDI, especially in manufacturing. World Bank data show Vietnam's FDI inflows rose from $11.8 billion in 2015 to about $18.5 billion in 2023. Whilst during this time, the Philippines also saw a rise, but still far behind, from about $5.6 billion to $9.1 billion. In other words, Vietnam attracted roughly 2 times as much new FDI as the Philippines by 2023. Much of that has gone into factories, electronics, Samsung, LG, Foxconn, textiles, and increasingly auto and components. For example, global electronics giants have set up major facilities in Vietnam. Samsung alone has invested approximately $18 billion across 8 factories there, producing over 60% of its smartphones in Vietnam, and making Vietnam the world's largest hub for Samsung production. This industrial FDI boom contrasts with the Philippines, where foreign investment is often concentrated in services, call centers, finance, real estate, and only limited factories, some semiconductor assembly, but far less mobile electronics manufacturing. So, how did this happen? Vietnam's success is no accident. The government has consistently pursued pro-growth reforms and global integration for decades. In the early 2000s, Vietnam opened up its economy. It joined the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 2007, which bound tariff cuts and opened markets. More recently, Vietnam has been aggressive in free trade deals. It was an original member of the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, when it came into force in January 2019, giving Vietnamese exporters low tariff access to Japan, Canada, Mexico, and other Pacific markets. It implemented the EU-Vietnam Free Trade Agreement, EVFTA, in 2020, which has already boosted EU-bound exports by nearly 50%. It also joined the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, with ASEAN plus 5 in 2022. Each agreement dismantles tariffs and opens services markets, cementing Vietnam's place in global supply chains. Within Vietnam, structural reforms have accompanied trade deals. The government has eased business licensing, streamlined customs, and cut bureaucratic red tape. The World Bank's Doing Business report ranked Vietnam 70th globally by 2020, outperforming its peers. Special economic zones and industrial parks, often with tax holidays and ready infrastructure, attract factories. Over the last decade, the state invested heavily in roads, ports, and power plants to support industry. For example, building expressways connecting Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City and diversifying energy sources. It maintained a competitive currency and stable macroeconomy, encouraging foreign firms to set up assembly lines. Large tech companies, Samsung, LG, Intel, and Apple, have all chosen Vietnam. For example, Apple now has 35 suppliers in Vietnam, the most in Southeast Asia, making Vietnam its 4th largest production base globally. Samsung's 8 Vietnam factories, with $18 billion invested, produce 60% of its smartphones worldwide. These moves were driven by Vietnam's policies and its labor costs, skills. Companies see Vietnam as a reliable, low-wage manufacturing hub. Vietnam also invested in its people. Primary and secondary schooling expanded and vocational training was promoted. As a result, Vietnamese workers are generally more skilled in math and science than Filipinos. Vietnam's PISA scores, international student exams, are among the world's best given its income level, while the Philippines ranks near the bottom of all OECD, ASEAN countries on student achievement. In 2022, 90.9% of Filipino children were not reading proficiently, learning poverty, versus just 18.1% in Vietnam. Finally, Vietnam's political system, an authoritarian one-party state, can push reforms quickly and stay consistent over time. 5-year economic plans and centralized decision-making mean that infrastructure projects and legal reforms face less legislative gridlock. This is a double-edged sword in other ways, but in economic terms, it has allowed long-term industrial targets to be met. In short, Vietnam's strategy has been open up and invest. The combination of free trade, FDI incentives, infrastructure build-out, and human capital development turned Vietnam into one of the world's fastest-growing economies. As the Vietnam Economic Times notes, this manufacturing boom and foreign investment have propelled the economy into the ASEAN top ranks. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.